Okay, folks, next Just Outdoors program will be about the history and the people involved in the Deer Lake, Moose Lake area resorts, specific people that pioneered that area, and some of the fish that were caught in that area, and just generally talking about a lot of the resorts and how they developed and what happened to them since the late 20s and into the 50s. And with us we have Elmer Voigt, who is a historian from that area and really likes to talk about the Deer Moose Lake area, since he also stayed at, and his parents and grandparents owned a resort called Voigt's Resort. So Elmer, anything to say about that?
Yes, it wasn't my parents that owned the resort, it was my Uncle Charlie, and my grandfather owned Cedar Wild Resort.
Very good, and we're going to be talking all around that area.
Okay, very good.
And should be a good show.
Just Outdoors is brought to you in part by the following community supporters.
Jervelin Hardware Inc., Deer River. Jervelin Hardware offers a broad selection of paints and sporting goods and a complete line of plumbing and electrical supplies. Jervelin Hardware, 108 Main Avenue, Deer River.
Meds One EMS encourages outdoor enthusiasts to prepare for the adventure. Meds One offers wilderness, first aid, and preparedness training for groups of all sizes. Prepare for tomorrow's emergency today. Call 326-0020 or online at meds-one.com.
This program is sponsored in part by Brewed Awakenings Coffee House. Brewed Awakenings is a green business with the mission to be a cafe where a person can eat every day and be healthy. Nurture your inner being at Brewed Awakenings, downtown Grand Rapids on Highway 2 East, across from the courthouse.
Hi, my name is Tom Chapin, and welcome to Just Outdoors. This is a program to bring you the bare facts about the woods, waters, and wildlife of Itasca County. And today we have a very special guest. His name is Elmer Voigt. Elmer, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom.
And Elmer, you are one member of a pioneer family from the Deer Moose Lake area.
I am, Tom. My my great-grandfather came here from Wisconsin in 1895, and he settled on the west side of Deer Lake, and he started a logging camp there. Actually, he logged in Wisconsin also, and he logged most of the pine between Chase Lake and Deer River, and it took them about 3 years, and they hauled it all out with horses. I understand they floated some down the river to Deer River and down the Mississippi. And also then, after he logged for a while, he bought 165 acres on the east side of Deer Lake, and that is the Baker Place now. Unfortunately, he caught pneumonia in the logging camp and died in 1915.
Okay.
So
really what we're going to do today is talk about, and those people that are familiar with the Deer Moose Lake area, they're going to connect on this thing here.
Oh, yes.
Especially that beautiful drive between the two lakes. That's exactly the area that you have been established with your family all those years.
Exactly.
So we're going to talk a little about the history of the Deer Moose Lake area, some of the people that inhabited that area that you knew that helped develop that area, the resorts, and then we'll talk toward the end on some of the tremendous fishing that took place there over the years.
Fine.
And maybe still is, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Well, tell us a little about yourself.
Okay, I was born in 1929, and I spent 4 years at Cedar Wild Resort with my folks and my grandfather. And then we moved to a new home over near the Voigt Resort, just around the corner.
Okay, Cedar Wild was on the east side of Moose Lake?
It was on Moose Lake.
Moose Lake,
on
okay.
the east side.
Most people
That's
know where
correct.
that is. You go up
Yeah.
the east side there.
It's still in business. One of
You
the
bet.
resorts
Okay.
is still in business. But anyway, then I went to the Fawn Lake School for 8 grades. That was a one-room school.
And where was that located?
That was on the west side of Moose Lake. And it would be, if you'd know where the Krantz Resort is, it'd be just up the road from the Krantz Resort, about a mile, mile and a half probably.
Yeah, and Fawn Lake is on the north side of Moose Lake, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
You can almost see Fawn Lake from the school. That school, the land was donated by P. Rowland that had a farm right next door. And he had some children that wanted to go to school, so he donated that property. But anyway, I went there for 8 years. Different school teachers. We had mostly young ladies, and they maybe had 1 year of college or so. Then they would come and teach the country schools.
Did you say this was a one room or?
One room.
One room,
And a
okay.
library.
Okay.
And a little hallway going in there.
Yeah.
It still stands, as a matter of fact.
Wow.
Somebody is using it for a summer cabin. But anyway, then I went to the Grand Rapids High School for 4 years, graduated in 1947, and it was necessary for us to board out there because there wasn't any school buses that come out to Deer Lake. So we stayed there during the week with families, then we'd come
Really?
home on weekends, and of course we'd come home in the summer. Then after I graduated from high school, I worked for a year at an outboard motor factory where my brother was going to aeronautics school at Galesburg, Illinois. At that point, the draft was getting very close to me, so I enlisted in the Air Force. I spent 4 years in the Air Force, 29 months of it in Alaska, and I had an opportunity to do some fishing up there and hunting, and it was a great country, just loved it. Then when I left Alaska, I came back to Brooksfield and San Antonio for a discharge, and the Korean War was on, so they extended me for a year. And then when I worked in San Antonio, I interviewed officers being recalled to support the Korean War. Actually, that was in 1952, so they didn't have to spend much time in the service, about a year probably, and then they got out. But that's about the length of my service. But then after I was discharged, I came back and went to work for the Diamond Railroad, headquarters at Duluth. And I worked there for 34 years. My last 15 years was as trainmaster. And when I retired early in 1956, which gave us a good opportunity to go to Florida and come back here in the summertime, and we're still doing that. So that's about the size of my life.
Okay, well, how did you get connected with I mean, we're going to talk about Voigt's Resort
Yes.
up there, and a lot of the resorts in that area.
Okay.
So maybe we can hold off on that, and you
Yeah.
could tell us, there's a lot of resorts back in those years in that
Yes.
area, weren't there? There's still
There's
quite a few of them.
probably about 20. No,
And you're only talking 2 or 3, 4 lakes in that area where there's 20
That's
resorts.
right.
People made their living with resorts.
they
and
did,
a lot
and
of
they
people-
had a tough time because the Depression hit, and that caused a lot of resorts to go bankrupt, and they struggled. When the Depression hit, people didn't come to the resorts anymore for a while. So it was very tough. My grandfather was one of them.
Okay, well, you got a list of resorts there, and then you're going to tell us how you connect with some of those with your
Okay,
family, right? Because you've got
I'll-
3 generations we're going to talk about here in your family.
Yes, we're going to talk about way from 1900 to 1950 or through
Sure.
the 50s.
Yeah.
A little bit about that.
Yeah.
Okay, Camp Sherwood, that was built in 1915, and it was built by Mrs. Christensen. Her husband was a doctor in Minneapolis, but you didn't see him up to Camp Sherwood very often. This was a girls' camp, and they had girls probably from Chicago mostly, and Minneapolis, and they came generally from fairly well-to-do families that could afford the camp. And it was a great camp. She had riding horses, she had archery, tennis, had canoes, boats, nice dock there, and the girls could go camp on Picnic Island, and it was just a wonderful place for them. I had the opportunity to work there one summer when I was about 14 years old, and we stayed right at the camp, and we'd get up about 6 o'clock in the morning and go to work, and we had a lot of grass to cut, and we had to water the horses and do all kinds of things, and probably work just about till dark too. I remember one time another friend of mine worked with me. He was about 14 or 15 too, and we were taking the horses down to water one time, and he would lead one horse and ride a horse. I would lead a horse and ride another one, and we were going down to the lake, and when those horses got near the lake, they made a beeline for the water. There was no stopping them. Well, this particular time we went into the lake, and all of a sudden the girls started screaming and hollering next to us, and there was about 10 of them out there skinny dipping. And nothing we could do but to sit there on our horses, you know, and try not to look at them, you know, because we knew Mrs. Christensen was going to tell us about this.
Yeah, yeah. Is that resort still going?
No, that's closed now, but they have lotted it off, and a lot of the counselors have bought some of the land, and so they have summer homes there.
It's made up of just summer homes now.
Yes, except the lodge is still there.
Okay.
And Gunny Gonzalez bought that from Mrs. Christensen, way back in 55, I suppose, something like that. And she ran it for a long time, and then she kept the lodge after it closed. The lodge is still there, and I don't know about Gunny, whether she is.
Yeah, I read a sign, Sherwood Forest Road up there.
Yes.
Is that?
Yes, that used to be the old Deer Lake Road. And then when they put the new one in.
19 there.
Yes, then Gunny wanted to leave that one a gravel road, so it was kind of unique, you know.
Okay, so that's the history of one of the bigger resorts there that supplied a lot of information.
Then we can go down to the Hiawatha camp. Right now it's a church camp run by the Lutherans, I believe.
Is that west of Sherwood here?
That would be west.
Okay.
And that was a boys' camp, and that was built by West Domes. And West Domes had that for quite some time, and he also worked for U.S. Steel part-time and ran that resort, and finally he sold it and moved up the line and built Mayflower Resort. That was then a girls' camp, and the boys' camp was turned over to Chet Thompson, I believe his name was.
Is that, again, west of Hiawatha now?
That would be west,
Mayflower,
yes.
okay.
West up around the corner.
Sure.
And West Domes built that and built a couple of cabins. And later that was sold, and West Domes then retired. And it was sold a couple of times, and then Smitty bought it. Mm-hmm. And his name is Denny Smith. Mm-hmm. And he ran it for a while, and then he sold the Mayflower Resort, went across the road, and he kept that property on, well, we called it Bell Lake.
Just a small lake across the road.
Yes, Bell Lake,
there, yeah.
then it was called Four Boy Lake, when Domes owned it, and now I think it's Smitty Lake, I believe. Mm-hmm. And Denny Smith built 3 nice log cabins there. It's just beautiful. Anyway, then I'll move on to Deer Path Resort. That was built by Ken Kellen, and that was probably 1938. And also there's Nyquist Resort, and that was built by Joel Nyquist, and he was quite a man. He did a lot of inventing. Actually, I have one of his inventions at home. It's a shovel about this long and a scoop like that, and it's made to get a log and put it into a wood stove.
Oh.
So you could lay it in there wherever you wanted to. That was one of his inventions.
Practical tool for
It was a practical tool, yeah. And he did a lot of inventing. He was a nice guy. Right now that resort is owned by Louise Nyquist.
So it's still a resort?
It is still a resort, yes.
Okay.
I believe she has it for sale now. If you wanted to buy a nice resort, that would be one to buy.
Okay.
Then there's a Blue Haven Resort. That was built by Jelmer Hansen. Came into the country, and I believe he was from Chicago. He built one of the most modern resorts that we had in the country, and he built that in about 1938. And It's still there, but it is lotted off, and private people own the cabins, but it still kind of looks like a resort. Then there was Cedar Wild Resort. That was a great resort. My grandfather built that in 1900. This is over on Moose Lake now. I'm kind of jumping away
it's
here.
It's not that far. It's just up the road about a half a mile.
It is, yes.
Like that?
And he built that in. He got the property, homesteaded it in 1900, and then he started the resort in 1925, and he kept that resort until 1933. And that's where I lived when I was only 4 years old, up to 4 years old. Then a man by the name of Herman Siggy bought it, and he operated it for quite some time. Now I believe it's owned by a family by the name of Peterson, I believe, and they're still running it as a resort, and it's one of the nicest resorts left in the country. And hopefully it'll stay there for a long time. I don't believe I talked about Pinehurst Resort yet. This is back on Deer Lake now, and that was a fine resort. It also went bankrupt during the Depression, and Bill Creedon bought it in 1938, and he modernized the cabins, and it was a beautiful resort, a beautiful beach there, and all of the people that stayed there just kept coming back. They didn't have to advertise at all. They also served meals in the lodge. Actually, people from Deer River could come out there and have dinner if they wanted to, and some of the cabins ate in the lodge. They didn't have facilities to cook in some of the cabins. Some of them did. So Mrs. Creedon was a cook, and they worked very hard there. And one time Bill Creedon told me, it was about 1940, I believe, that he's making $10,000 a year, open only 2.5 to 3 months. And this was something unheard of in those days.
Pretty good, big money back.
Very good money.
Is that the resort that's right on the Narrows there?
Yes, it's right on the Narrows.
Two lakes come real close
and
together.
Voigt's Resort is right next to it.
West of there?
Just west of Pinehurst.
Okay.
Now Pinehurst has been lotted off, and all of the cabins have been sold, and the lodge still stands. I heard it was for sale a year or so ago.
The lodge is for sale?
It was a year ago.
Okay.
Maybe they sold it.
All
I
right.
don't know.
So most of these, what I'm hearing, a lot of these have been just lotted off.
Oh yes, definitely.
Because there was just enough incoming money and interest to keep the resorts going. And
the resort business in this country is very difficult because sometimes you only have 2.5 to 3 months to earn the money, you know, and sometimes the weather turns bad, things aren't right, and fish aren't biting or something, and it's very hard for the resorters.
Yeah.
It was kind of strange to me because I saw a lot of people come from Minneapolis, Chicago, and buy resorts thinking that they could come up here and just kind of take it easy and make a living from the resorts. Not so. Those resorters
never
are up.
experienced the winters, did they?
That's right. Those resorters are up at 6 o'clock in the morning and working until 9 o'clock at night. So it's, you know, the boats had to be pulled out every night on Deer Lake now because the winds would come up during the night. They were using all wooden boats, so they had to be pulled up, tipped over, washed out, and then whoever worked there, which would maybe be somebody like me when I was a young fella. I did work at Pinehurst one summer, and then in the morning I would have to go down there, turn the boats over, shove them back in the lake, tie them up to the dock, get ready for the tourists. And of course there's a lot of grass to mow and all that. Mr. Creedon was right up there with me, and he worked all day long, a hard worker. Wonderful person too.
Well, you learn by example, and that's what you did. But you mentioned about 7 resorts already, and you're only talking about maybe a 2-mile section of beach, aren't you?
Yes.
Of lakeshore.
Yeah. So now this Voigt, I'll get into the other ones in just a minute. How's our time doing?
We're doing good.
Are we doing okay? Voigt Resort was right next, and this was owned by my uncle Charlie, and he built that resort in 1920. I believe.
This is your dad's brother?
No, my grandfather's brother.
Grandfather's brothers. Oh,
yes.
Okay.
And my grandfather had the resort over on Cedar Wild before then, and when they started this Voigt's Resort, they moved a cabin across the lake in the wintertime and started the Voigt's Resort. And then later, Charlie built a store, and this store and it was kind of a recreation area. He had slot machines in there. He had a bowling machine in there. He had several other games for children. And people would come, young people would come from Deer River, swim at the beach, and they would go down to Charlie's. I don't believe there's any young person that was in Deer River that didn't know about the Voigt Resort. And it was a very popular place. The resort now is closed. The store is closed, and there's a gentleman that bought that. I think he worked at MPNL or something, and kept the store open for a short time, but he finally closed it.
So how long were the years of the store being open?
That store, I would say, was open for 25 years.
From 19 when? 30, late 30s?
Well, I would say 1940, the store probably was built, and it operated until 58, 59, something like that. When Charlie got sick and couldn't operate the resort anymore, my aunt Ethel Icola ran it. She ran that store for a long time. Everybody knows her in the country also. She's a wonderful person, still alive, and just as bright as can be.
So this is pretty much where you spent your childhood?
I spent my childhood there, yes, up until I got out of high school.
Okay.
And of course, like I say, I had summers all off from school, and I worked at the resorts or Sherwood or somewhere all summer.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then we go down to Linden Grove. That was owned by HeadQuest. That was a 100-year-old farm 20 years ago. They were one of the early settlers there. And one thing about the HeadQuest Resort, there was Clarence and Maynard with the boys. And Maynard went into service first thing when the war broke out. And Mrs. HeadQuest was so worried about that boy. She didn't think he would ever come back from the service. And he spent the whole time over in the islands in the Pacific. And sure enough, he came back just as healthy as can be, never got a scratch. So that was a wonderful thing. Clarence, he ran a resort while Maynard was gone, and he also worked with Donald Drotz with Drotz and HeadQuest Builders. They built a lot of cabins on Deer Lake and Moose Lake and in that whole area. They also built that first Deer River Hospital. They built the arena at Deer River. So they were quality builders. And let's see, we go down the road here. We can go to Satko's Resort. That was built by Ed Satko probably in 1936.
Where's that located?
That was on Fawn Lake.
Fawn Lake, okay.
And it's very close to Moose Lake, too. Mm-hmm. It's very close right there. But he didn't have a landing on Moose Lake. He had on Fawn Lake. And that's about the only access to Fawn Lake today, is through the Satko Resort. It's still being run, still operated. The Drotz brothers, the younger Drotz, bought that, and they're operating it. And Ed Satko, of course, has passed away, and Dolores just passed away this last year. There was also Krantz Resort. That was on Moose Lake. These are all connected to Deer Lake.
Sure.
Deer, Moose Lake, same thing, really.
You only got a little road running between them.
Yeah, a little road running in between them, but they fished on both Deer and Moose Lake, you know. And he built a pretty good-sized resort there. And his wife taught school at the Fawn Lake School the last year that it operated, which I suppose was around 1952, something like that. I was gone in the service, so I don't know exactly when it closed. But he had a very nice resort, too, and it's still being operated. And it's one of the best resorts on the two lakes. And there was a Shady Shore Resort built by Carl HeadQuest. The HeadQuest came in about 1900 to this country, and they had a large farm there and also started a resort on Moose Lake. And that resort was started, I understand, in 1932. And the only one I haven't really talked about is my grandfather's resort. But I think I did mention it a little bit. It was Cedarwild Resort. He homesteaded that property in 1900, and then he didn't build a resort until later, about 1915. Operated it for quite some time, and then eventually sold it. Ran into trouble during the Depression. He'd built a bunch of cabins there, and he had financed them through the bank, and was having trouble paying for them, so he was forced to sell his resort. And later he worked for Charlie as a guide, and he did a lot of trapping and things like that.
Well, you know, you look at all these resorts on those two lakes, and the income levels at different times. In your opinion, when would be the peak decade of the resorts?
The peak times?
Yeah,
I would say the peak times would be. Actually, it sounds strange, but I would think during the war.
Oh.
For some reason, people wanted to go to the resorts, maybe to forget about things, but the resort seems to always be full then, during the war.
During the early 40s.
And then probably the 50s.
50s, okay.
I'd say that would be the prime time. The prime time would have been during the 30s, but of course the Depression hit. They were doing great guns before the Depression hit.
So actually into the 60s and 70s, you started probably to see a lot of resorts disassembled.
Exactly.
Sold off as lots,
that's when it
bankruptcy, and just not enough people coming up to support them.
Yes, that's what happened.
And you got a lot of resorts in a small area too. So
yes, there's a lot of resorts, and I'm not listing all of them here.
A lot of competition there, just on
a lot of competition is right.
But that made them better, though.
Yeah. Oh yes, and they cooperated too. If they were full, they would refer the guests to other resorts.
Wouldn't you? Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to get a bad name from another resorter.
That's right.
If you're going to make your living at it, that's for sure.
Yes, actually, when Ethel Ikala retired from the resort there at Voigt's Resort, when she sold the store, she went to Deer River and she worked in the Chamber of Commerce building, and she referred people to the resorts that were still open. So she did that for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, and she really enjoyed that. Yeah.
Well, resort people know how to work, and they know how to make money, and they know how to. They'd be a good person to hire.
Absolutely, isn't that the truth? Yeah. She was
good work ethics, and
she was great. Yes.
Okay, well now we got rid of that topic as far as explaining just the concentration of people in resorts in that little area, Deer Moose Lake. I mean, they're big lakes, but they aren't.
Oh yes.
They aren't huge lakes. They're just.
No, but you know, Deer Lake is pretty large, and it's kind of round, and it could get real rough. So you would have to be careful if you took tourists out there that you didn't get into rough water. We used mostly wood boats. They're not as good a boats as you have today.
Yeah.
So they couldn't take the rough waves.
Especially you're facing south, so you're looking at storm damage, I suppose, along that north end. You know, north end of a lake usually gets it worse than any place. So.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So, interesting.
Deer Lake is just a beautiful lake. It has the islands. It has rock bars in it.
Clear water.
Crystal clear water. The beaches are nice, although it's doesn't have good beaches all the way around it. Some places they have clay and rocks and so forth, but there are places that have nice beaches.
Well, we'll talk about some of the fish that come out of it a little later, but there was a conservation group up there that you are familiar with, or maybe were involved in. I don't know, but there's a lot of history in some of the people from that area that got together and formed this conservation group that really kind of was the vanguard of that whole area there.
Oh yes, and most of the resorters, the big resorters, belonged to this conservation group, and they were all concerned about the fish, especially the walleyes in Deer and Moose Lake, and so they were very active in this. This is a picture of a meeting of the conservation group, and this is a picture of the conservation group. We don't have all of the members here, but I think when this picture was taken, they were going to build a Deer Lake Hall, and they were talking about where they were going to cut the timber to do it. One of the men here is Wes Domes, Bill Krantz, Howard Graber, Joel Nyquist, Charles Voigt, Carl Hedquist, Herman Sigge, and Maynard Hedquist. And they were the backbone of this conservation group. They met in homes until the Deer Lake Hall was built. And that was built in 1950 to 1953. They cut all the timber for it, they sawed it, they planed it, they built the hall, and this was done in 3 years. I got in on building the hall, but I did not help to cut the timber because I was in the Air Force at the time.
Well, there's anybody lived in that area for a long time wouldn't recognize any of those names.
They would
right?
recognize these
Every name
names.
there, yeah, yeah.
They're all old-timers there.
Yeah, okay, great.
Okay.
And then you had some other history of that area there besides that. You had some photos involving some of the type of equipment they use,
yes,
and what they use
we can
for
go
play.
back to Pinehurst Resort. In the early 30s, they had a slide that went into the lake, and they used these carts, and they look like a creeper.
Yes, they do.
But if you'll notice this picture, it's turned upside down, and it has little steel wheels on it. They're like a railroad. They would go on a railroad track. And actually, they had a little railroad track, you might call it that went from the bank down into the lake. And the tourists would be able to slide down with these into the lake and then pick it up and come back up and do it again. They had probably 15 of these. I actually own this cart, and my son-in-law has it now, and he's going to keep it. He likes these old things. So anyway, it was a lot of fun for the tourists, but it only lasted for 3 or 4 years, and then they eliminated it because I think somebody had an accident or something.
Yeah,
so,
we're talking summertime now.
we're talking summertime.
Yeah, going into the water with that
This is
thing.
summertime, exactly.
That's some pretty basic recreation
yes.
right there.
They also had speedboat races there at Pinehurst at about that same time when this was operating. And of course, a speedboat at that time was 10, 15 horses, maybe 20. I don't know exactly, but they were not very fast. But they ran those races for 4 or 5 years that I know of, and then they had to quit doing it because there were so many complaints that they may be killing the fish in Deer Lake. But I don't think they would have been. But anyway, that's why they.
Look what they're doing today with one motor, huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, at least they were concerned about their lake. That's good.
Yes.
Okay. I know you got some really interesting photos here of the area.
This one here, I think we're done with. Yes. Here's a picture of my grandfather trapping beaver in those days, and he has 4 or 5 beaver there, and that was very common in those days. There seemed to be a lot of beaver, and they trapped mink and otter and so forth.
A lot of people supplemented their income with trapping back in those years, didn't they?
Yes.
You're talking about probably about the 30s in there, aren't you?
Yes.
Something like that.
This would be the late 30s.
Yeah. That's when the beavers started to come back, because in the 20s, I understand that they pretty much trapped them out. So
now,
this is really...
the resorters had to pack fish and ice and so forth to ship them back for the tourists. They also had to provide ice for the ice boxes in every cabin because there wasn't any electricity in those days. So they needed a lot of ice, and it was a hard job. So in 1935 or so, my father built this ice machine. I have written on the back 1938, but I believe it was 1935 or so. And he could cut up to 1,000 cakes at a time. Sometimes he'd cut 2,000, but he didn't want to do that because if you would get a crack in the ice or something, you would lose the whole field.
How big is a cake?
A cake is 16 by 16, 16 inches by 16, and it would probably be about 22 inches thick. Now here I'll show you how it operated. This would be a field of ice. This is 30 by 20.
They cleaned the snow off of this area?
Yes, they had to clean the snow. First they would plow it with a plow, and they would plow runways to pull the ice away from the hole with, and then they would have to take an ice scoop and get it right down to the glare ice. Then in the morning, my father would go and he would cut this field of ice, and he would start down one edge like this, and he'd let his saw down 20 inches if the ice was about 22 inches. So it would leave 2 inches so that it wouldn't flood. So he would cut down like this. Then he had a gauge he'd put in there, and that gauge was 18 inches wide, and he would cut the whole field this way, and then he would turn his saw and he would cut it this way. And about 11 o'clock in the morning, then the resorters or whoever ordered the ice would come and they would open the hole. And the way they did that was they'd take this corner piece, this corner cake out of here, and then they would take the two hand saws and they would saw completely down here, that 2 inches of ice that was left, down like this, and then they would just put the spud in there and poke it over and it would break loose. They'd pull that cake straight out onto the ice, and they did that with this whole end here. Then they would turn those hand saws down and they would cut down this way, and they would go 6 cakes apart. And then my father would be out here and he would break it off with a spud. Then he could just pop them, they'd break loose, float in the hole, and the workers then, which would be the resorters or whoever ordered the ice, would use long-handled ice tongs, and they would pull these out. And when they did that, they had to have creepers on their feet because they didn't want to slip. When that hole got opened way up, it was a very dangerous situation. The ice was slick, and the more you pulled out those cakes, the slicker it got.
The water came up to the level of the top of the ice.
Yes, it did.
Right when they opened the first cakes, right?
It
It worked its way through.
And then when you had some equipment around there and all the men around there, it would cause it to come up closer yet.
But that
to the
2
top.
inches of ice underneath this whole area,
Yes.
it was enough to hold all the equipment, everybody on there.
Yes, but you didn't put the equipment out on the field.
Okay.
It just the workers that were cutting those cakes loose. The men pulling out the cakes would be around the outside. And of course, eventually they were all floating and you could pull them out from either side. After we got about 20 cakes out on the ice, we'd throw a heavy rope around them, hook it on a pickup or hook it on a tractor and pull them away a couple of 100 yards so that we wouldn't have pressure pushing the ice down and flooding the whole thing.
Okay, how many cakes did they do per winter?
It would depend on how big the resort was. Some resorts would take 700 cakes. Some of the private homes would take only 20 cakes. And when we got done with this, which would be about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, some of the private people with their cabins would take their 20 cakes right then. But the resorts would have to wait. That was a big job for them because they had so many cakes to take. They had to prepare their ice house and so forth. When they packed these in the ice house, they would, so supposing they would have an ice house that would take 20 wide, and 20 both ways. They would put these cakes in there, and then they would throw snow on top of them and work the snow around in between all of the cakes so that they wouldn't freeze. And then they would take sawdust and put around the edge, which would be they'd leave about a foot on the edge, and they'd put sawdust there to keep it from melting in the summertime. Then when they got that layer done, they would put about 2 inches of snow on there, and then they would put their other cakes on and make another tier, and they'd do it, maybe they'd put up maybe 6 tiers, maybe only 3 tiers, depending on how many they needed, you know.
So the sawdust would eventually go over the top when they were
Yes,
done
the
with it.
sawdust would go over the top, and they'd try to put about 3 feet of sawdust over the top. And then when they got their cakes out in the summertime, they would just shovel this sawdust away and take 1 cake, then they'd cover it back up again. And they'd last all summer long. There'd be ice left there in October.
So is this the only operation that supplied ice to all the residents and resorts in that area?
Most everyone ordered ice through this, yes.
Right through that?
Yes, because otherwise they would have to take this ice saw, which I don't know if you're aware of what the ice saws look like. They had large teeth. They probably were 2 inches long, so they would really cut ice. But if you had to cut through 20 inches of ice and cut 400 or 600 cakes, it would just be a tremendous job.
So that was a major operation every winter for all the residents in that area.
It was, and they almost all of them ordered ice through that, and sometimes my father would contract to put up ice for some of the smaller places. And my brother and I, we got elected to do that. We'd haul, and we were only about 16 years old when we started to do that. And he had a car and a trailer is what we used. And we were stuck half of the time and putting chains on and everything, you know. It was not easy.
How many people worked on an operation like that?
I would say we'd have probably 20 people out there when we opened the hole.
Boy, did you ever have an accident there? I mean,
no, the only accident we had, but no one was hurt, was on Deer Lake. They had a hole open. They had cut 1,000 cakes a couple of days before, and they went out there to cut another 1,000 cakes. And we had a slight drift of snow, and it had frozen maybe 1/8 of an inch ice or 1/4 of an inch ice over that hole. Well, they were cutting my father was cutting the other field right next to it, and my uncle was there, and he was going to go and get a shovel. Well, the shovel was on the other side of that hole, so he took off across there, and down he went. And of course, right away, my dad went over there with a long-handled pick or something and handed it out to him and got him out of there. But that ice it was cold, you know. He could have drowned, there's no question about it. But he was a pretty strong individual, and he made it all right. But that's the only accident that I know of that we had.
Well, there was sure potential for accidents.
Oh yes, no question about it.
Tell me when that, what years did this eventually dry up?
That dried up.
Of course, it was like electricity coming in, of course.
Yes, right after the war.
Okay, so this was all pre-war?
Until, yes, and it operated until, in the early 50s, because everybody didn't get electricity right away.
Same time. Oh,
yeah, and of course they had to get all of their refrigerators too in these resorts, which took a while, you know. So, but it dried up in the early 50s.
Yeah, I remember going to resorts in the late 50s, early 60s that still had ice available like that.
Oh yes.
That they took out.
It was very important for them because, like I say, they packed a lot of fish, and they packed them usually in wooden boxes, and they would use ice and usually just grass is what I saw them. Fresh cut grass is what they like to pack them with.
Interesting. Yeah, well, that was available. Didn't cost much. Okay, now that we're talking about that, let's talk about, let's go into we got a little time left here, the fish.
Okay.
And I know that there's different methods that fish were taken in those areas over the years, and legally.
Yes,
nets were legal for certain types of fish.
Yes.
But maybe before we get in there, we should talk about Fawn Creek.
Fawn Lake Creek?
Yes.
Yes.
And then, we'll get into the...
Fawn Lake Creek was one of the creeks where the walleyes spawned, and they spawned heavy.
And tell us where that was.
That was on the north side of Moose Lake, between Moose and Fawn Lake. And also there was another creek there, there was a little Moose Lake Creek, but for some reason the walleyes did not want to go in there like they did the Fawn Lake Creek. I think probably because that Fawn Lake Creek would be a little bit flooded in the spring, and they could wiggle out into the grass and so forth.
What do you remember seeing there?
Walleyes.
A lot of walleyes.
If you would catch them right, you could put a light in there, drive up on the bridge, put a light in there, and it would be just alive with eyes. Solid eyes.
Reflective eyes from the walleye.
From the walleyes, yes, that's right.
And so those fish were actually working their way up into Fawn Lake.
It seemed like that they worked up as far as the bridge, and then they didn't seem to want to go through that culvert very well. And then on the other hand, the northerns came down from Fawn Lake to the bridge. They did a little bit go through, but if you wanted to see northerns, you'd be on the north side, and if you wanted to see walleyes, you'd be on the south side. But the northern spawned before the walleyes. Sure. And
so that gave you an indication when you saw this, how many walleyes, the walleye production in Moose Lake was very good.
There were a lot of walleyes.
And you see any muskies?
I did later, but they would come maybe a couple weeks later, or 3 weeks later.
Yeah.
I was one that was in the creeks all the time. I was looking for suckers and so forth. I was out in the woods all the time.
Sure.
So. Sure. Yeah, I saw big muskies, and I saw them more over toward the dam that came out of, actually there was a creek that went between Deer and Moose Lake, then it branched off and went down the Deer River. And right where it went down the Deer River, the CC's, Civil Conservation Corps, built a dam there, and the muskies would come up to that dam. Also, the Conservation Club saw that there were fish, especially northerns, going down the river, so they put a net across there to try to stop them, and that net plugged up with wood and rushes and one thing and another. So then they built screens that would fit in the dam where the boards went, so they could put their screens in there, and it had they were about that square, maybe 2.5 inches, something like that, where the good-sized northerns can't get through anyway. And they put those in there, and then they had a caretaker there when the northerns were running, and he'd go and brush those screens to get the weeds and things out of it, so because that could act as another board or another dam to build the water up, and they didn't want that to happen, you know.
Okay, you got some pictures of some tullibees or
Yes.
ciscos.
These are ciscos that were caught in Deer Lake. I believe it's Deer Lake because it says Deer Lake. And it was about 1946. And this is Clyde Rhodes with my father.
This is Clyde Rhodes over here? Yes.
This is Clyde Rhodes over here.
Okay.
This is my father here.
Okay.
And this is a net that they used, and it had kind of small mesh so that the ciscos would stay in there. Whenever they netted whitefish, they'd use a different kind of a net that had bigger screens in them.
What'd you do with those fish?
I think they canned a lot of them, but I'm not sure what they did with them.
Okay.
I really can't answer that question.
Okay. And this Mr. Rhodes is, history is Rhodes Outboard here in
That's
Grand
right,
Rapids,
Rhodes Outboard, and he sold Johnson Motors, and here's one of them right here. This is one of the first motors Johnson made, that green 2.5 horsepower motor. And I'm pretty sure that's one of the first ones there. They came out right after the war, I believe, 1946. And I think they might have been made in Illinois.
I think everybody that lived around here had one of those in their garage at one time or another.
I had a 5-horse for years.
Yeah, and that was a bigger motor, 5 horse.
It was a bigger motor.
Yes.
They came out just a little bit later, after the 2.5.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got tullibees, and then you've got other pictures of some. I didn't realize that they fished bass so often and so much back in those years. But bass was a big deal.
A lot of people didn't know that, but we had fisher people who would come up, guests who would come up to the resort, and that's all they wanted to fish is bass.
Probably because that's what they knew back in
That's what
Illinois,
they knew.
Indiana.
Maybe that's possible.
Sure.
But they had a secret fish to catch because there weren't too many of them that fished bass back in those days. Here, my father is here, and my brother and his wife, and of course that's me over there. This is a catch that we got in, I believe, about 1953. And we caught these, I believe it was on the String, which is a string of lakes that would be up by the old Day Lake CC camp. The Day Lake CC camp was on the east side of the road, and the String is on the west side. Yeah, of 38. This is correct. And it had a lot of nice bass in it for a while, and it seemed to me like they kind of got fished out.
Yeah, those lakes would be, if you go there today, it'd be like on the second parking lot into Sumi Hills.
That's right, that's where
ski
it is.
area back in there,
Yes.
and your trails back in there.
That's right.
Kind of hard to get to still,
Yeah,
you know, even.
it
But
is.
That's the lakes probably.
You have to walk in there now, I
yes.
believe, yes.
So that's
And
where you got them.
The old CC camp had a tower there where they looked,
Yeah.
they watched for fires and so forth, but that tower is gone.
But there weren't bass like that in Deer and Moose Lake, where there.
No, Deer Lake had smallmouth bass, but you could thank the Conservation Corps for doing that too. They went to the hatchery and got them in 10-gallon cream cans and planted them. As near as I can tell, they were the first bass in Deer Lake, the first smallmouth, and they planted them at the Head Quest Resort on Deer Lake. And I would say they'd have probably 30 10-gallon cream cans when they went in a 4-wheel trailer and brought them, and the Conservation Corps did that.
Did they plant any other type of hatchery fry?
Yes, they planted walleyes too, and they planted a lot of them in Moose Lake and Deer Lake, but I don't know of them planting in any other lake. except they tried to start a rearing pond up on Pughole Lake at one time. They dammed off the north end, and they planted suckers in there, which they said they had to have, and then they got the fry from up at Cutfoot Sioux, I believe, and put in there, but it never worked. They couldn't get the walleyes out of there, or couldn't seine them, so they just abandoned the thing and took the dam out. So.
Yeah, with the equipment they had back then, it probably wasn't worthwhile. Sure.
But anyway, these bass fishermen used to go to Long Lake, Bighorn Lake, Big Cottonwood Lake, Spider Lake, Little Cottonwood, Amon, Lawrence, Hill, Graves, and then of course they would go to Moose Lake for the walleyes and muskies, and Deer Lake for walleyes and muskies.
And a lot of the resorts had boats on those lakes, didn't they?
They did.
Available for some of their
They
patrons?
did. Mr. Brown up at Crystal Waters had boats on a lot of the Bass Lakes. That was really a bass fishing resort, and they were very good friends of Mr. Creedon running Pinehurst. So Pinehurst guests could use the boats that Mr. Brown had.
Yeah.
I think his name was Mike Brown. Came about the same time that Bill Creedon came and bought Pinehurst.
Yeah, well, the object was to make your patrons happy, right?
Yes.
Pretty much. I mean,
Yes.
because they would come back the following year.
Oh, absolutely.
And,
most
that's
of
what you
these
counted
people
on.
did come back.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and advertising wasn't a huge deal
Yeah.
back then, was it? It was more word of mouth and families.
There
and things
wasn't
like
much
that.
advertising,
Yeah.
and it was word of mouth mostly.
Yeah.
That's the way the girls' camp operated too.
Yeah.
They got their girls through word of mouth in Chicago,
Sure.
and but they ran a good ship too.
Yeah. Well, you wanted to provide recreation and fishing, didn't you?
That's right, yes.
Because it's a family thing for
Yes.
the kids, yeah. And the kids would come back as adults.
They
They
would.
go forever.
They kept coming back,
Yeah.
generation after generation.
Look at your family. I mean, it stayed there for
Oh
a
yes,
great
they
deal,
did.
so-
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, there was a cabin across the road from my folks' place, and they're a Fadden family from St. Paul. And we knew three generations of the Fadden family. They kept coming up, and the kids come, and now the great-grandkids are there.
Yeah.
I see their scars
You
there
bet.
right now.
You bet.
And that place was an old Sackett place. They built that around 1900.
Okay.
And that building is still standing.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Fadden used to be so particular about painting that house. She would have the painter scrape that paint right down to nothing, and then repaint it again. And you can sure tell it has the same siding on that it had in 1900.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, Elmer, this has been great. You have, of all the people living in that area, you are a real historian of that. I mean, I
Well-
can't imagine anybody else would know more about that area than you right now.
At my age, I probably am.
Well, and you're interested in it too. See,
I am.
That's what it takes.
And I've been interested in Deer Lake. That's one of the
Yeah.
most beautiful lakes in the country.
Oh, it's just gorgeous up there. How many
is.
islands does that lake have? Deer Lake? Is
I
it
don't
just
know. I'd guess it probably has four
Four or five islands out there. Okay.
Also, those islands, those small islands, used to be good for duck hunting.
Okay, yeah.
They'd go out there after all the other lakes froze over. You could go out there in those small rush islands, set your decoys, and there'd be mallards come in there like you would not
When there
believe.
used to be ducks, you mean? Yeah.
When there used to be ducks. I doubt if they're doing it anymore.
Probably not a lot.
No.
Well, this has been terrific. I appreciate you coming in, and boy, anybody that's familiar with that area, when you drive through there now and you've seen the show, you're
Yes.
going to be able to connect with some of the names,
I
just
hope so.
just along with the signs in there.
Yes.
And for the last thing, you brought a couple things that you're
I
telling your
do.
grandfather.
These are-
I'm really into this stuff here now.
These
so-
are muskie plugs that were used by my grandfather guiding. And they have not been used since 1945. That's when he passed away.
I assume those are teeth marks on
These are teeth marks from muskies and large northern. And he fished mostly on Deer Lake. Sometimes he would guide a party and they would go for 4 days before they caught a muskie. But they were determined and they would catch them. So he told them that before they started. You're not going to go out there in 5 minutes and catch a muskie.
This was one of the largest bait companies in existence at that time. And this is really all you could buy was from that company. Pretty much 90% of the plugs that were bought in the 30s and 40s, these are all wooden.
Yes, they are.
And it's called the Creek Chub Bait Company. Creek Chub Bait.
It could be.
That's what they are, because they're the only ones that had the little lip there that was a right angle. It's almost
Okay.
90 degrees there. And boy, those things work in the water.
Oh, they
just
sure
move
do.
all over the place.
They look
and the
like a
faster
fish.
you go, the deeper they go.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so they're not being used much today, but I know that they work because I used one the other day and did very well on them.
Did you really?
The fish have not forgotten. You go back and you think they worked back then. Why wouldn't they work today? The fish haven't changed.
That's right.
The people, the equipment has changed,
The
and the
equipment-
perception of what works has changed.
Yes, the equipment has changed, and they used to have to be careful about the line that the guests had on their rods and reels because the muskies would break that line. So
Yeah.
my grandfather would check that line before they would go out fishing every
And that
time.
was before monofilament.
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was. It was all
Yes, it
like
was.
cotton line.
It was.
Yeah, all woven.
But my uncle Charlie had new line in his store, so
Yeah.
he would sell
Interesting.
new line.
Well, very good. I'm glad you remembered those.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much for
You bet.
coming in.
Thank you, Tom.
I'm sure everybody watching this will appreciate the history.
I sure hope so.
Oh, great. and thank you, folks, for watching Just Outdoors, and stay informed.